So thank you. It's a delight to be here, and thank you for those lovely introductory remarks and so on. I'll answer the question that many people often have when they hear all the things I've done and letters after my name. Yes, I have a lot of student loan debt, so just got to get that out of the way. In the medical world, of course, we have the standard disclosure slides. I'm neurologist infectious disclosure, not flavor in my presentation. Although I always point out that I don't know if the FDA has ever formally approved mouthing as a use of board books. This is my son, who is actually a high school senior now, getting ready to graduate or virtually graduate from high school. And he's highly embarrassed that I show this photo, so I show it as often as possible, of course. He is indeed mouthing my first book of sushi there. So it is a food-related book, at least. So here's the thing. I spent many years doing primary care pediatrics. And when I talk to people about the fact that I do primary care pediatrics and that I get to give books to children and talk about reading with families, I often get this. Oh, that's so nice that you've done that. That's so amazing. And yes, you know what? It is such a really nice thing. But I want to move people beyond an idea that when we do things like this, that it's so nice. And I want to get them to a point where they realize and recognize that this is actually absolutely critical. And it's critical not just to that family, not just to that child, and not just to our community, but really to all of us as a society. So I'm going to help lay out some things that make this case. For some of you, this is well familiar. For some of you, I think you understand some of these principles, but I think hearing them articulated in a different way. And for some of you, this may be absolutely new. So I'm going to try to, walk that line to kind of make sure we're giving everyone something to walk away with that's new, or that you can at least chew on. So on our voyage together today, we're going to talk about the world of the early brain. We're going to talk a bit about the reality of reading and then kind of how Reach on Read fits into that. And I'm going to spend some time talking about this very odd, strange reality that we're all in right now collectively as a society, because I would argue that this sort of conversation needs to happen even more when we're in times like this. However, as you heard, I also have a master's degree in children's librarianship, so I thought everyone deserves some story time, including adults. So I thought I'd start by reading you a story that many of you may be familiar with, Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak. And you'll see the images appearing on the screen as I read out loud. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind and another. His mother called him, "Wild thing!" and Max said, "I'll eat you up." So he was sent to bed without eating anything. That very night in Max's room, a forest grew and grew and grew until his ceiling hung with vines and the walls became the world all around. And an ocean tumbled by with a private boat for Max, and he sailed off through night and day, and in and out of weeks, and almost over a year to where the wild things are. And when he came to the place where the wild things are, they roared their terrible roars, and gnashed their terrible teeth, and rolled their terrible eyes, and showed their terrible claws, till Max said, "Be still," and tamed them with the magic trick of staring into all their yellow eyes without blinking once. And they were frightened and called him the most wild thing of all, and made him king of all wild things. "And now," cried Max, "let the wild rumpus start." I will let you fill in the sounds of rumpusing in your own heads, because we all rumpus a little differently, so I want to respect that. "Now stop," Max said, and sent the wild things off to bed without their supper. And Max, the king of all wild things, was lonely and wanted to be where someone loved him best of all. Then all around from far away across the world, he smelled good things to eat, so he gave up being king of where the wild things are. But the wild things cried, "Oh, please don't go. We'll eat you up. We love you so." And Max said, "No." The wild things roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. But Max stepped into his private boat and waved goodbye and sailed back over a year and in and out of weeks and through a day and into the night of his very own room, where he found his supper waiting for him. And it was still hot. So there's a reason that I chose that book, but we'll come to why that is in a little while here. I want to start now about spending a little time talking about the world of the early brain and what we know about it. This whole concept of early brain and child development is very important, and the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2011, 2012 made it one of their key strategic goals for that year. And I'm proud to have served on the Early Brain and Child Development Leadership Group at the Academy. The first chair of that group was none other than Oregon's own Dave Willis, who I've actually spent a lot of virtual time with in the last 2 days on another group that I'm on. So that's actually where I first got to know him and really learned so much from him. So the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child over 10 years ago came out with this lovely report where they said, let's take all that we've learned from the science over decades of what we know about the brain and children and so on, and let's try to pull this all together into some key points that we can use to drive the advice that we give, the programs we set up, and the policies that we enact. And even though this report is now over 10 years old, every single thing that they said is actually still just as true and has even been strengthened by what we know. So I want to walk us through those items really quickly. One, they said child development is a foundation for community and economic development. Now, we don't talk about children this way often, right? That this is something that is an interesting way to think about how we discuss children and who they are and what they do. But the thing is, children and the development of children's brains is indeed a foundation for how we think about communities and how we think about our society. So we need to think about talking about children the way we already do. But we also need to recognize that children are part of what we should be terming infrastructure development, that brain infrastructures matters just as much as highways and bridges and tunnels and so on. Number two, brains are built over time. Now, this is short, but it's very powerful, right? That if you think about it, the brain of a child, yes, there's a lot of what I'll say about the importance of these critical periods and how it's so much better if we do it earlier. But by no means does that mean that if we don't get it right early on, that everything is absolutely lost later. People can always learn. They can learn well into adolescence, through adolescence, and into and through adulthood. It's just, it takes more work. It takes more effort. It takes more resources. So it's really important that we recognize that. That also means, however, that we can't just do things early and then say, okay, we're done. Okay, they're 5 now. We don't have to support anything else, right? Ooh, no, we definitely need to. So we need to really take the long view when it comes to brain development. And if you think about it, there's a 3-legged stool for thinking about children's development and health trajectories. The first leg is the biological factors that we look at all the time in healthcare. We want to make sure that those factors are well addressed, which is why we look at them. But then we recognized it wasn't just those things that mattered, that socioeconomic environment mattered, that the zip code that a child is born and brought up in matters more than their genetic code, and that just a few blocks can make a key difference. But then we recognized it wasn't just that broader socioeconomic environment, it was also the microenvironment around children. Who's at home? Who's in their early childhood center? Who's in their neighborhood and family? And how are those folks interacting with that child on an everyday basis? And that set of attachment and relationship patterns was really the third leg of the stool. And that brings me to the next point, that if you said, okay, what is it that shapes the developing brain? Because here's the thing, right? Human beings are born with kind of a lot of useless skills, right? Or not even skills. We just don't have a lot of skills. We're kind of useless, right? I mean, look at a baby animal, right? Most of them after being born, like within an hour or two, they're standing up and like starting to walk around. How long does it take a human to get there? It takes like a year. My goodness, we're really useless, aren't we? Right? A year to get get where other animals get in an hour. This is because the brain, the human brain, is not fully cooked, so to speak, at birth. So we spend a lot of time, particularly in those early months and years, that brain is still finishing wiring up. The plus side is that we end up with a much larger, much more complex brain than other animals. The downside is that, wow, we're pretty vulnerable, and this also means that that brain is susceptible to whatever is happening outside. So you need your genes. That's one thing that you need in order to, for these neurons to know how to wire to each other. But then the other thing is you need experiences. Those experiences help guide which neurons wire to which other neurons, and here's the important part, for what purpose. Okay, are these neurons, and you need both of these things, by the way. It's kind of like a campfire. You need wood and you need a spark in order to get that flame going. You can't have one without the other. So are those neurons coming together to wire for love, learning, curiosity, experience, social connection? Or are they coming together to wire for fear, for safety, for self-defense, for danger, for all those sorts of things? That's where experiences matter, because we can't modify genes too much. I'm not going to talk about epigenetics today, but we also know that we need to figure out, but we can modify experiences. And how do we modify experiences? It's through the advice we give, through programs we set up, and through policies that we enact. Okay, and then you might say, great, that's wonderful, but what's the single thing that matters the most? If we had to hone in on one thing that we should be focusing on that would make the biggest single difference by far, what would that be? That active ingredient is what we call a child's engagement in serve and return interactions, like in tennis. You serve the ball to your partner, they volley it back, and you're going back and forth, back and forth. That serve and return interaction of children's engagement in relationships with the people around them, that's the key thing. And that's the only thing that drives development forward in young children. I want to say that one more time, because if you remember nothing else from today, this is the thing to remember. The only thing that drives development forward in young children is their engagement in interactions with loving, nurturing, responsive adults around them. This means there's no toy, no DVD, no YouTube video, no app that is going to drive a young child, and by young I mean under age 3 for sure, that's going to drive their development forward in the absence of a loving, caring adult around them. This is really important because parents are being bombarded with messages telling them, please put your child in front of this app. It's good for their brain. This DVD is educational. It'll help them learn. There's no research evidence showing that these actually do those things in younger children. And parents are being marketed, told, do this, do this, do this, when there's actually no evidence. And what those things do is they actually remove the child from those interactions that they should be having. As one of my colleagues once said, there is no app to replace your lap. T-shirts available online. No, I'm kidding. So do keep that in mind, that we need to be pushing that protecting and promoting these loving, nurturing interactions is the #1 thing we need to be thinking about. I'm going to play a short video for you, and if it doesn't come through cleanly, and by the way, I'll make these slides available to the organizers later, so you can always pull the links that I have at the bottom off if you need to. All the videos I show today will be are on YouTube. This is the face-to-face paradigm developed by Ed Tronick at Children's Hospital in Boston. I worked for him when I was an undergrad, and he'll explain what happens, and you'll see what happens when these interactions go well and when they don't go so well. I'll let him explain.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 34 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. And the still face experiment that the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing. It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when we stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So when I used to code these as an undergrad, the hard part was not seeing interactions like that. That was actually what we'd expect, you know. Kid got upset when the parent wouldn't respond, kept on doing these escalating bids, you know, "Mom, hey, try this, okay, point at this, hello, what's going on here," right? All those sorts of things. And then mom came back after baby got upset and everything was fine, no problem. The hard part was when we would see the mom go into the still face and the baby didn't seem bothered by this at all. They just kind of, kept on doing what they were doing, looking around, playing with their hands, whatever that might be. What was going on there? This child was not used to that back and forth, that face-to-face interaction, so they didn't feel the absence of it. Now, here's the thing. I don't believe for a moment that any of the parents in our studies, or any parents anywhere really, don't love their kids, don't want the best for them, you know, don't care about them. No, you know, parents universally love their children, and there's no group out there that has cornered the market on that more successfully than any other group. The thing is, we think of this back and forth, this interaction, this face-to-face play, all of that, we think of it as being something that is automatic, you know, instinctual, etc. And the reality is it isn't. It's actually learned behavior. How did we learn it? Well, we learned it because people around us did it. So we had someone to kind of model it for us, and pattern it and so forth. So we want to make sure that we don't just make that assumption that it's automatic, and instead we show people how to do it. We help them be successful at it. We coach them through that, and that's really important. All right, moving ahead to the fourth point. Real simple, you need simple things to be able to do more complex things. And I know that may seem obvious, but people wonder, why are we investing all this money in children just going and playing, right? That's the view of quote unquote daycare, right? That they're not thinking of it as early education. You know, if you need to do those simple things in order to do more complex things. So as many, including T. Barry Breslin said, play is the work of infancy. If you want to think about, you know, early education programs as being early workforce development, be my guest, because that's in a way, that's what they are. This next point we'll spend just a touch of time on, which is about toxic stress, and it's associated with these persistent effects on the neuroendocrine system, and it damages the architecture of the developing brain in ways that can cause lifelong problems in learning, behavior, and physical and mental health. So the brain is affected by what happens in these environmental circumstances. Let me start by giving you a very extreme example. These are head CT scans. So if you're not familiar with how to read these, this is looking at the head. It's like there's a cut halfway through the head here looking up into the brain. So it's almost like you're at the foot looking up into the brain there. The child on the left is a child who is typically developing. These are both 3-year-olds. The child on the right is one who underwent extreme emotional neglect. Okay, this is not physical neglect. They were fed and bathed and clothed and all that. This is a child in a Romanian orphanage in the 1980s. It was like a warehouse, essentially. Tons of children, not enough people to care for them. So they were going from kid to kid very quickly, just trying to get them fed, cleaned up, move on. Very little social interaction occurred. That child on the right, on the other hand, had a more typical development. Without knowing a whole lot about how to read a head CT scan, my goodness, you can see a huge difference there. That head on the right is tiny. It is small. That brain looks shrunken. It just hadn't had a chance to develop because it didn't get those inputs. So I'm giving you this extreme contrast because you can see that very easily without a whole lot of effort. There's more subtle changes that can happen that are that you need specialists to kind of point out when it's less extreme, but we know these changes happen. We all have stress responses to changes in the world around us. We have a neurologic response, but then we also have a hormonal response where we put out something called cortisol, which is known as quote unquote the stress hormone. And these hormones and all are designed for when you're walking in the woods and suddenly a bear appears, okay? And that bear appears and you're trying to save your life, okay? You're pumping out cortisol, you're putting out more glucose into your bloodstream, you're tamping down inflammation, your heart beats faster because of the epinephrine or adrenaline, because you might need to fight or run or whatever the case may be. These all help you deal with a bear. However, our modern society is more complicated. I personally have not run into any bears in both city or country locations, but we have other stressors that we deal with. Work stress of one sort or another, family stress, stress when you don't have the right slide appearing on your virtual presentation, all those sorts of things. So the thing is, not all sorts of stress are necessarily problematic. You can have 3 levels of stress response kind of in terms of thinking about this. You can have small stressors which are positive, right? You actually learn from these sorts of things, right? So the next time I need to do one of these, I figured out exactly which setting I need to flip to make sure that I get those right slides going. Yay, I learned something, right? This is a good thing, right? This is what we call positive stress. There are more significant stressors, though, that are more serious, but they're temporary and they're buffered by supportive relationships. When you have other people saying, hey, you're doing the best you can. Hey, what help do you need? Hey, what can I do here? All those sorts of things help buffer the effects of that stress, and that's why it's tolerable. It's okay. It's not a big deal in the long term. But then you have toxic stress. This might be the same kind of stress as tolerable stress, but it's prolonged, it's not temporary, and there's few or no protective relationships. And as another one of my colleagues from the EBCD group said, Andy Garner said, socio-emotional buffering is the primary factor distinguishing the level of stress. If you don't have that buffering in place, what might have been tolerable becomes toxic. And you can almost think about this as a vector that transmits disparities between generations. So in a child's life, there are these situations that are fairly bad, that often there's few or no protective relationships. These are things that we see far too often: child abuse, parental substance abuse, homelessness. These things affect young children who don't yet know how to cope, right? So if I suddenly became homeless, like tomorrow, I have a whole skill set of things that I know how to go look for help, how to go seek assistance, how to find out what it is I need. I have resources, I have social networks, I have all those sorts of things. A 2-year-old doesn't have that, right? They don't know how to deal with these things. A 2-year-old doesn't know how to simply report that they're being hit at home, etc., etc. So what happens is, because they don't have those skills, it affects their very biologic system, right? How their endocrine system and all are interacting in a way that's so profound and so damaging to them that we call it toxic stress. And that's what toxic stress really means, is that it eats away at some things. And it's sort of a vicious cycle that happens. They have these stressors. This bear response, what we call a fight or flight response, becomes chronic because it's the only thing in their toolbox that they have is, I got to look for danger and I need to protect myself from danger. They pump out more of these stress hormones. This changes the brain in some key ways. But here's what we see. We see a kid who's hyper responsive. They have more of this stress response. They're not as calm. They can't cope as well. And that in turn feeds into more childhood stress. This is critical to understand because when you think about, say, 2-3-year-old children on day one of preschool, child one, loving, nurturing, responsive household, no major issues, et cetera, they get into story circle, teacher's reading out loud. The kid does what the 3-year-old does sometimes. They just start talking. Teacher looks at them and gives them a bit of a frown. Kid sees the frown. And what do they think? Oh, oopsie. Okay, when mom gets that frown at home, that means I did something I shouldn't. And they shut right up, and there you go. That whole interaction is barely noticed by anyone, including the two people in it, because it's so minor and so fleeting, right? It's just done. Kid number two, same setup, same story, except this kid grew up in a household with a lot of stress, a lot of violence, a lot of shouting, a lot of yelling, things like that. Same thing happens. Teacher gets that little frown on their face, and that kid sees that frown, and they don't think, oopsie. They think, uh-oh, someone's going to yell at me. Someone's going to hurt me. Someone's going to start throwing things. I need to protect myself. So what do? They freeze, or they dive under the table, or they run out into the halls screaming, getting away from danger, because to them, their brain's going, bear. And what do? We all say, what's wrong with that kid? Nothing happened, and they flipped out. Oh, something did happen. A lot happened. And guess what? All that stuff that happened in that kid's head, it kept them alive until now. It kept them reasonably safe. You know, they're 3. What do you expect them to do? Call the authorities? I mean, you know. So that's the thing. We need to stop asking ourselves what's wrong with that kid and ask ourselves what happened to them. Why does this response make sense to that little 3-year-old? And that helps us start to figure out how to answer questions. I want to briefly spend a few moments looking at 3 brain structures. Bear with me for a moment. This is work that's been done by my colleague Seth Pollack right here at the University of Wisconsin. He finds that the amygdala, which is the fear center, the worry ward of the brain, the self-defense, the protection, is actually slightly enlarged in kids who've had this early toxic stress. I want to emphasize here, it's not that they were born with larger amygdala, it's that their amygdala became larger because of the environment around them, right? So this was socially caused probably because it got stimulated more and used more, because again, that bear response is all they have. Now, there's 2 things countering the amygdala, 2 key things. One is the prefrontal cortex. This is your planning, your executive functioning, kind of the air traffic control center of the brain, your delayed gratification, all that. In kids who've had this early adversity, he sees on functional MRI, there's less activity in the prefrontal cortices and lower neuronal density. And then there's the hippocampus. Plays a big role in memory and mood. And they see smaller hippocampal volumes in children who've had that early adversity. So you can see there's all sorts of things that we can show on an MRI scanner. However, no one has ever walked into my clinic and said, hi, doctor, we're here today because we're concerned that our child's hippocampal volumes may be too small, right? Hasn't happened yet, and I don't think it will. Instead, they come in saying, we're worried, school's worried, my kid's impulsive. They can't plan ahead. They're anxious. They can't delay gratification. Their mood's all over the place. Their memory's crummy. And this sounds like a lot like what we often label ADHD or something like that, maybe. But here's the thing. Some of them do have ADHD. And you know what? There's nothing insignificant in their history. They just can't pay attention, even though everyone's trying. Okay, great. Put them on a small dose of stimulant medication. They actually do really well. However, when I was in a primary care at a community health center, that was like 5 of my patients. Not 5%, 5. So what about all these other kids with ADHD diagnoses? What I found is when you dug just a little bit in their history and gently, supportively, but still clearly ask families, was there any violence in your home? Did you always have enough to eat? Were you ever homeless? Was your child ever the subject of domestic violence? What you'd hear is yes, 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 and yes, over and over. And you start to realize what you're seeing is not actually this plain old classic ADHD, that these are the brain changes from adversity. And the problem is, I nor anyone else has a magic medication to make that go away. And that's why we see such lousy response to ADHD medications. they do something, right? They often take the edge off a child's behavior and may keep the family from going nuts or the classroom environment from falling apart. So I'm not completely opposed to that, but that can't be the end of our answer. There needs to be much more in terms of supporting that family as much as possible. Many of you may be familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, although there's a lot who aren't, which for them, I always say it's the most important study they've probably never heard of. This was the large landmark study that looked at 17,000 adults and said, what happened to you as a child in terms of different types of abuse or trauma? First time anyone looked at this. People often think, oh, this is a study of people who live in poverty. Actually, it wasn't. This was middle-class folks from the San Diego area, mostly white, mostly having attended college, now in their 50s, and it was split between men and women. This is not actually your stereotypical impoverished at-risk population. Okay, so please notice that this is actually a study of the middle class. They looked at these different categories of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, and the numbers appearing on the right are the prevalence of all of these different things in this middle class cohort. These are really high numbers. 26% said they were physically abused at least once during their childhood. They did not expect numbers this high. Even the smallest number up there, 6%, that's still 1 in 20, which is an awful lot of people. Now, you can't really measure intensity, right? How do you say someone's physical abuse was twice as bad as someone else's, right? It just doesn't work that way. But what they did was they said, well, what if we give a point for each of these categories that they say yes to, and that's called an ACE score. And they said, okay, so how many people had different levels of ACE score? A third had none, but 26% had 1, and 4, 5, or 6, meaning lots of different categories of ACEs. Again, 1 in 20 for each of those. They did not expect these numbers to be this high. But again, there they were. And then they found if you measured it, if you compared it now to what happened over their life, the effects were cumulative. So just a couple of slides I'll share with you. This is your risk for delayed child development, of being developmentally delayed in the first 3 years of life. If you had 5, 6, or 7 adverse childhood experiences, you had 75 to nearly 100% chance of having developmental delay, compared to a much lower number if you had just 1 or 2. And we know that developmental delay is expensive, right? You got to look for it, you got to screen, you got to evaluate, you got to refer out for further evaluation, PT, OT, speech, all those sorts of things. That takes a lot of resources. It's necessary, but wow, look at what a big difference adversity plays here in terms of child development. This next slide blew my mind. This is your risk for adult heart disease. If you had 7 or 8 adverse childhood experiences, you had triple of the odds of heart disease as an adult than someone who had none. Heart disease, right? There's virtually nothing that we talk about with heart disease that triples your risk, right? Even a lousy diet doesn't necessarily triple your risk. Yet, here we go. Here's something right here. It's baking into the biology of young children changes that are now playing out many years later. But the last point that they made was if we got it right early on, it was more effective and less costly than trying to figure it out later. We are a society that likes to fix things later. We don't like to prevent. And unfortunately, we pay a lot more and end up with worse results as an outcome. Jack Shonkoff at the Harvard Center on the Developing Child points out a few key areas to think about. We need to reduce these layers of emotion and behavioral problems on top of these fantastic intellects. You know what I'll tell you? Every week, I have the privilege of talking to some kids who are actually quite smart, quite intelligent, and really get it about what's going on with their lives and so on. These are teens. Where am I seeing them? At our county juvenile detention facility. Okay, obviously they're there because things didn't go right, but they're actually very smart. But there's some other issues that are layered on top of that. Every single week, I think about the lost potential that I'm seeing every time, right? That it's highly unlikely that these kids are going to be able to pull out of these nosedives they're in. I'm not saying it's impossible, but many don't. Who they could have created? Who knows which child halfway across the country that is languishing in prison could have figured out cures to cancer or figured out world peace or How to Get Us to Mars, or written an amazing symphony, or whatever the case may be, right? We as a society lose out on that benefit when we don't get it right for all kids. Point number 2, children live in families. You know, I know that's obvious, but the fact is that we can't transform children if we don't transform their lives of their parents. And there's a lot of folks sometimes who say, you know, I don't mind helping children, but it's their parents that I don't feel so good about helping. Really? Okay, well, but that's the single biggest influence on the child. And then finally, health and well-being is not just the world of healthcare, but it's also everyone's job. That health and well-being is not just the medical world's kind of way of doing things. So a number to remember that I think is really critical is that for every dollar we invest in early childhood, we see $4 to $9 in returns. And who says that? Well, Nobel laureate in economics, James Heckman at the University of Chicago. Way more qualified than I am to make that assertion, but he has pointed this out, that the best bang for our buck is in programs targeted towards the earliest years. And long before we had MRI scans, cortisol assays, and fancy economic analyses of exactly this sort, we had Frederick Douglass, who told us it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. So, having said all this, you might be hearing all this and saying, yes, this is all important, whatever, but you know, haven't you looked outside the window? We kind of have a pandemic going on, right? How can we put resources to towards all of this? And the fact is that there is this reality of what's happening to our economy, what's happening to our medical systems, and so on and so forth. The thing that I want us to remember, though, within all of this, is that families still face challenges. And arguably, they're facing more challenges than we've ever seen, you know, across a societal level and spanning socioeconomic bounds in many ways. This is a picture of the COVID-19 dashboard at Johns Hopkins just from earlier today, right? So you can see, you know, 3.2 million cases around the world, 1 million of those in the US, the number of deaths that have been laid out there, et cetera, et cetera. We get bombarded with this all the time. You don't need me to repeat this. However, I will point out 1 million cases in the US of confirmed cases, recognizing there may be more out there, of people who actually have contracted the virus and have it and have been tested for it. Okay, so how many families live in the US? So looking at census data, 2019, well, it's about 83 million families. Okay, this is family units, so there's more than one person within those units. That's a lot more. That's a lot more than just those, you know, than the 1 million who are, you know, currently known to be infected with COVID-19. And most of those 83 million families are isolating themselves to some extent, right? Depending on what their local jurisdictions are telling them, right? But they are staying apart. They are not doing things. They are not working. They are not going to school, et cetera, et cetera. Well, so I would argue that COVID-19 is actually affecting families in a much bigger way, in a much broader way than the actual infection itself, that the psychosocial fallout of this is even more profoundly wrenching to our society than the infection of the virus itself. And this is not to downplay, you know, how devastating the virus can be, particularly to those at risk, but it's saying that we can't ignore also what's happening with everyone else. And here's the thing, struggles have always been present in our society, right? We've always had, sadly, adversity, poverty, all these struggles that we talk about. But what's happening now amidst this pandemic is that these things are being laid bare. They're in front of us in ways that are even more apparent. The cracks that have always been there are in many cases fracturing completely, particularly for communities that have been historically challenged, communities of color, folks in low-income neighborhoods, those who are marginalized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they are the ones that have always needed some help, and my goodness, they need it even more. And the folks kind of who've been in better off circumstances are also needing it. So the needs have gone up mightily. And I wanted to share a couple of ways that I almost think about this in painting. This is from in the 1800s. This is Dante and Virgil. Dante's there under red. Virgil is his guide through hell in the Divine Comedy, and he's, you know, they're just looking at, you know, what's happening here in the second circle of hell. And in this second picture here from Delacroix, you can see Dante there with the red on the left-hand side there, just looking horrified at what's happening. He cannot imagine what's going on around him, cannot fathom it. But you notice what Virgil is doing there. He's grasping for his hand. He's saying, I'm here with you and I can help you. Hold on to that thought because we'll come back to it. I want to spend a few moments now talking about the world of reading, because the reality of reading is not what everyone may think. A lot of kids are read to on a regular basis, but there's also families in which reading does not happen as much. There's this statistic that's been bandied around a lot about how low-income families, the children in those families hear 30 million fewer words than their more affluent peers before the age of 4. This has been criticized in a number of ways, and those criticisms are often valid. But the point is, it's not just simply saying it's about the number of words. If that was the case, we would just tell people, bark words at your children. You know, it doesn't matter what they are. No, it's actually a proxy for the interaction that we talked about, the back and forths that we discussed. So what can we do to help with those interactions? Well, first of all, why focus so much on reading? Because reading is the fundamental skill for learning. We live in a text-heavy society, and you need to be able to decode text efficiently in order to be able to do a lot of things. So when a young child is aware of books, not necessarily reading, but they're aware of what this thing is that we call a book. And I don't get to do this on stage too much. I can pick up a book off of my office floor and just say the way that we have a book here, and it's bound in a certain way, and that in our society we turn books in a particular direction to open it, and that when we look at words we read them going in a particular direction, and so on and so forth. Those sorts of conventions of books and how we use them are what we mean by book awareness. So first, children understand that printed words actually have meaning. This is key to this notion of emergent literacy, that print is conveying information, that it's actually telling you what to say. A young child, a child younger than 3, they don't get it that those funny black marks on the page actually have meaning. They think you're telling the story, the reader, simply because you're looking at the pictures. Wow, and you use the same words every single time. Isn't that neat, right? So that once they get older, to about 3 or so, if they've been exposed to books a lot, they say, oh, there's something going on with these words. And when my daughter was 2 and my son was 3, I had them both up at my lap. I was reading aloud from a book, and my thumb was over the right-hand side page, and I was reading the left-hand side. My daughter just listened away. She was 2, but my 3-year-old son reached down. He shoved my thumb out of the way. He was looking at these black marks and saying, there's something going on here. And for an example, I might put this up and you say, gee, that might be kindergarten scribbles. Well, maybe, or you might say, I think that's actually trying to convey something. Yes, that's calligraphy. If I clean up the Chinese characters, that's what it looks like. And you might say, great, I still don't know what that means. All right, let me decode it for you. That's the phrase Middle Kingdom, or Zhongguo, which is China. That's how you write China in Chinese. And now you can make that connection. And in Where the Wild Things Are, if you think about it, what is the very last page? The last few pages are, and Max sailed into the night of his very own room, where he found his supper waiting for him, and it was still hot. That last page, and it was still hot, there's no picture. It's just words. And when a kid hears you read that page with just those black marks on it, the same way that you read the other pages, but there's no picture, it makes them go, wait a minute, there's something going on here. And it's just a masterpiece way to end that book. Next thing, you use background knowledge and strategies to obtain meaning from print. So if I put this up and I say, in the great green room, there was a picture of a cow jumping over and all of you are looking at your screens, hopefully, and saying, moon, okay? So, and you know that. Why? Because you've read this book 82,000 times to a young child. Or, you know, the nursery rhyme about, you know, the cow jumped over the moon. Or you look at the photo and you say, wait a minute, I can see a cow jumping over what looks like a moon. And you can finish that. And a young child can finish those things easily. That they're able to obtain meaning from the context around them. So the wild things, again, roared their terrible roars and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws and did what with their terrible teeth? They gnashed their terrible teeth. I don't use the word gnashed in everyday conversation. Maybe I could start. It might be interesting. But gnashed is kind of an unusual word. I wouldn't expect a young child to know that. But they can figure it out from context. Those other things were scary-ish things that the wild things were doing. I wonder if gnashing is something scary with the teeth, right? And they can fill in that word and they can just move along, right? We use these skills our whole life. When somebody uses a word we don't understand, we can often interpolate and say, okay, I think this is what it means. I use this skill routinely whenever I read an ophthalmology report. I still have no clue what they're talking about. So, okay. And then finally, the more you look at text, you become a fluent reader. The other concept about early literacy that's important is this idea of dialogic reading, that reading becomes a conversation between the child and the adult. Because some parents will read exactly what's on the page and expect their child to sit and listen quietly to it. That doesn't work so well with a squirmy 18-month-old, right? They don't have the patience for that. And a parent who thinks that's what it means to read to your child may become discouraged, saying, oh, see, he doesn't like it. I don't like reading either. He's going to be just like me, right? And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So when we give them permission and say, open up the book, let your child open the book, let them flip pages, go backwards if you want to, talk about the pictures. You don't need to read the words. I'm not going to make you write an essay on this story, right? And say, hey, can you help me find Max in this picture? Where's Max? Oh, there he is. And what's he doing? Oh, he's in a boat. You're right, it's a red boat. That dialogue, that back and forth is what we call dialogic reading. And when we can model, coach, and encourage a parent to do that, they become a more successful and more confident reader with their young child. So we need to recall that reading to children may not be a natural skill for adults. We also need to be careful. Adults may not be able to read all that well themselves or at all. This is one of the last great shames in our society that people will not reveal, even to us in healthcare. And this can be a multi-generational issue. So reading's not easy. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of resources, a lot of brain power. It is really hard. We're asking kids to do all this at a really young age, you know, when those neurons are forming. So I don't want to downplay this. There's a lot of stuff that goes into being able to successfully read. We are hardwired for speech. We are not hardwired to read. This reading thing is actually something civilization came up with. And it takes a lot of effort and energy to do it and do it well. But when it is successful, and when we see a child reading happily and on time, then we know a lot of potential, a lot of the power of that early brain has come together. And that is where our colleague and National Medical Director Perry Class tells us reading is a triumph of the early brain. And most of all, we want reading to be fun, right? We want this to not be a chore. We want it to be something that they look forward to with pleasure. And that brings me to talk just for a few moments about how Reach Out and Read fits into all of this. Reach Out and Read started 30 years ago. Actually, one of the early clinics was down the hall at Boston City Hospital from where I was in this little converted closet coding those face-to-face videotapes that I played for you earlier. I remember hearing about it. Someone said, oh yes, the primary care doctors at this clinic are giving books to families at checkups and talking to them about reading. And I thought, oh wow, that's really neat. And I was an undergrad. What did I know? I proceeded to not actually do anything else until I got to participate in giving a book to a child at a checkup when I was a physician assistant. Started a program in PA school, ended up going to library school in the middle of med school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it all went from there. You know, Reach Out and Read, which really, we operate through the primary care environment. And this is so important because we're not building a whole new infrastructure, right? We're not hiring people to go out to homes and all that. we are saying, let's take an existing infrastructure and build and leverage that. Please remember, we don't pay doctors to do this. And amazingly, they still are clamoring to do it. In Wisconsin, I'm still amazed that so many people show up saying, please, we want to do reach out and read. And you know, especially when I'm talking to insurers sometimes, who sometimes I think are like, oh, will people do it unless we put an incentive in front of them? Well, we don't give them any incentive in reach out and read, except to say, we will train and support you and help you. And they say, yes, please, I want to do this. This is why I went into healthcare. Remember that it's a simple three-part model. The heart is here that the healthcare practitioner who's been appropriately trained and so on will work directly with the parent to encourage families to read aloud and offer age-appropriate tips. And if I had to sum it up in a single graphic, it's this item that's appearing here, what I call the prescription to read. I actually do hand these out in clinic. I also hand them out when I do state and federal advocacy. People remember them. And you notice, my old version of this actually used to say read books, and I changed it a few years ago. I said, no, it's actually share books together, right? It's not just here, hand a book to your kid and say, you know, go read, kid. We want them to share books together as much as possible. And I mean this because this may be the most important prescription I ever hand them because of everything I've just shared with you. We give them the book, and here's the thing. It is the healthcare practitioner who's doing the visit, who walks in with that book in hand and hands it directly to the child and watches what they do with it, because this is intentional, skillful observation of what's happening. This is a golden opportunity to learn so much about behavior, about development, et cetera, in so many different ways. And we don't want to lose that by having the front desk or the rooming personnel or someone else do this, because I want to see what's happening and use that as a springboard to have that supportive conversation with the family. And then, of course, literacy-rich waiting rooms, et cetera, et cetera. We are not, repeat, not trying to teach kids to read early. We want them to learn to love books. Okay, I'm not impressed by the 2-year-old who's walking in with a copy of Harry Potter or whatever the case may be, right? This is about enjoying books and having it become a regular routine in their lives. And again, why are we doing this through healthcare? Because we are one of the few near universal, non-stigmatized access points for young children. Okay, not many young children are not in early childhood settings. They're not being seen by home visitors, etc. But virtually everyone brings their kid in for checkups. I've had homeless families coming in for checkups. I've had rich families coming in for checkups, right? So it's not that it's this, oh, you need that special program, whatever. It's a near universal thing. And I think of programs like Reach Out and Read as being like the story of the blind men touching the elephant, right? That Reach Out and Read is kind of like the elephant, because people see different things in it. Most common thing I hear from people is, oh, you're doing a book giveaway in clinics, that's so great. And I say, yes, but you know, we're actually doing a whole lot more. The book is just one part of it. We're doing an educational intervention. We're doing developmental surveillance. We're helping build parental capacities. We're helping buffer toxic stress. How? That when we say to a parent, take just 5 minutes at night, sit your child down next to you, let them tuck in next to you, share the book out loud, let them hear your voice in that not stressed out parenting voice, et cetera, et cetera. You know, making sure that we're able to do all that. Assessing the relationships in the family, using a public health approach, and finally, a scalable evidence-based model, right? We want things that have an evidence base whenever possible, and we want something we can take to scale, right? Here's the thing, we can actually bring this to every family in the country with just the right investment of resources, and we can do it without breaking the bank. I think it's really important to recognize that. This is not to downplay the importance of more intensive, expensive programs like home visiting. Oh, we need them to exist as well, because some families need more than what Reach Out and Read can provide, but there's no way home visitors can get to everyone else. We need all these things in an interlocking ecosystem of parenting support to exist. So when it comes down to it, Reach Out and Read is not any one of these things. Really, it's all of these things. I think it's important to recognize that. And if you want to read more about that, you can read a publication called The Elephant in the Clinic, written by myself and another Reach Out and Read colleague. Just Google The Elephant in the Clinic. It's a free download from Reach Out and Read National Center and the Aspen Institute that goes into a little more depth on all of these things. Not a particularly long read. So remember, Reach Out and Read is not merely advice or a book giveaway, but it's actually secretly a process of parental skill building and support by already existing skilled and trusted professionals, right? That's the leverage that's so important. And this is why I submit to you that we have the reality of now, but we also have a solution for now. Not the solution, but a solution for now. Because we know that families need support. They're at home. They're wondering, am I doing okay here? Am I okay homeschooling my kid? Is my kid on the screen too much? Is my kid going to be permanently scarred by all this? Is my kid going to be have problems because they're not seeing their friends for weeks on end, et cetera, et cetera? These are all the fears that we're hearing, voiced and unvoiced. We know they're out there. We know many aren't calling because they're afraid of overwhelming our healthcare system, even if we're like, no, please call us. They need to know that all these things are important, and they need to know that they are doing the best darn job that they can, even at these times, and we can offer them a little support and some tips by supporting good relational health wherever possible, right? That connection, that face-to-face. And it's hard, right, to just say, well, do these responsive, nurturing interactions with your child. But if we say, we'd like you to share books together and here's some ways of doing it together, it becomes a scaffold. Reach Out and Read becomes a pattern that they can then use and follow to be able to say, ah, I get this. I can make this happen and I can do this together and I can be successful, yes, even at a time like this. And that we can adapt and be fluid in all these ways. And to go back to just a couple more paintings to share with you that it can change, because now here is Dante being led through by his guide Virgil, and I conceptualize Dante as being parents, families, and Virgil, the guide, being us, the healthcare practitioners, trying to bring people through this crazy time. And you notice how much calmer this painting is, right? And here they're meeting some of the great writers of history, Homer, Horace, Ovid, Lucan, you know, etc., and recognizing that maybe there is some good that can come out of this, that there are some ways. And maybe, just maybe, in all the stress that we're experiencing as well, ourselves as practitioners and worries, that maybe it can turn around. And you can see here, it's again, Dante and Virgil in the ninth circle of hell. And you notice what's happened here. Dante has his arm around Virgil. The roles have been reversed, right? And that even in this time of COVID-19 and uncertainty and pay cuts and worries about protective equipment and exposure, I think it's a wonderful, remarkable joy to be able to have a well child visit, to be able to talk to a family, even if it's on a screen, you know, or on a phone. I had a 7-year-old I saw in urgent care the other night who had a little laceration on his lip, and he was telling me with great gusto that it happened because he had his eyes closed while he was crawling across the floor and rammed into the edge of the table. And we had this great conversation about how it was probably a good idea to keep your eyes open when you're moving so that you knew where you were going, and so on. And then about how he had his stuffed bear, and I asked him if the bear had attacked him, and it was okay to tell me if the bear, and he's like, no, not at all, you know. So even as all this is around them, kids are still kids, and they can actually be a source of joy and delight and support for us as well. So I want to just come to a closing paragraph here. There's a video I'll pass just for time's sake and all, but it'll be in the slides and you can watch it again on YouTube. But I want to share this quote from the Sutton Trust. While schools can do much to raise achievement among children who initially lag behind their peers, all too often preschool gaps set and train a pattern of ever-increasing inequality during school years and beyond. Any drive to improve social mobility must begin with an effective strategy to nurture the fledgling talent in young children, so often lost before it has had a chance to flourish. And I think that's what we all care for deeply. We want that fledgling talent to be able to take wing and to take flight as much as possible. And I always end with here, this photo, which actually hangs on my office wall as well, is of my wife reading to my son years ago. They were caught in this beautiful moment of being lost in a book together. And it reminds me that children are made readers in the laps of their parents. It also reminds me that parents are their child's first and best teachers. And whatever we can do to make them feel comfortable, confident, and capable in that role, and have the capacity to do all things in their lives. At times like this, so much upheaval, and people are trying to hold down full-time jobs in some cases, while also juggling their children and feeling like they're not doing any of them well. Anything we can do to say, it's okay, we're all just trying our best here, really, it's all okay, is I think one of the best things that we can do. If you do social media, follow me on Facebook or on Twitter. Those are both public facing. My email address is also up there, but I know we'll be now taking a few moments to go to questions. Thank you so much again for all the work, interest, and so on that you do with children and families. It matters at all times, and it matters especially now. And thank you for enabling me to Zoom in virtually to share time with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Navsaria. Huge applause in the chat box from everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and to share your tremendous expertise and lived experience in this. So we have a great question in the chat box, and I'll open it up to folks. If there's anything else, any other questions that you want to pop in there, given time, we'll only be able to take a few of them. So I'll just do a quick moderation around those. So the question is, what are your thoughts about audiobooks for illiterate families?
I'm sorry, you cut out briefly there. Was that audiobooks?
So sorry, yes. What are your thoughts about audiobooks for illiterate families?
Yes, audiobooks I think are excellent. So, you know, first of all, it's not cheating to do audiobooks, right? Audiobooks for a child who's able to read can really help them turn off that text decoding part of their brain that sometimes can be so much work for some children, and just enjoy the narrative, the structure, all those sorts of other elements that exist. For illiterate families, audiobooks are one way for them to all share things together, or to have the audiobook going while they have the print book in front of them. I'll also encourage you, remember, for young kids, families with young kids, dialogic reading means forget the text, talk about the pictures, enjoy that, have that sort of interaction, it's okay. And then finally, if you want to really remove any feeling of inadequacy or stigma, there's amazing books out there by several authors. David Weisner's probably the known one, where there's no words. The entire book is wordless, and yet it's a rich narrative. So all of those, I think, are great options.
Great, thank you so much. And then another question is, Learning Ally is an audiobook app for people of all ages with print-based learning disabilities, and might this be a helpful tool? So any familiarity there?
Yeah, I don't know that one personally, but I will look into it, I think that, you know, what I always say is whenever we see anything that says this will help with X or Y, my first question always is, that's lovely, what a great idea. Show me what your evidence is that it makes a difference, okay? I just want to simply know that we are doing something that has at least some proof works, because there's a lot of great ideas out there in all sorts of fields that actually just don't pan out, right? So I want to make sure that before we start telling people do this, that we know that it's not pushing people away to do other things, and taking them away from that back and forth interaction. Because that was the problem, like with things like Baby Einstein. They made all sorts of claims about how good it was for children's brains, zero evidence, and parents were putting their children in front of it for hours on end. It wasn't just, I need you to be in front of this video so I can go and take a shower or put the laundry on. It was, no, they told me this is good for your brain, and it was pulling them away from that interaction. So it was actually, they were worse off. So I want to make sure that we're doing things that are evidence-based.
Thank you so much. So we have one final question that we'll take from the chat box, which is, do you have any recommendations based on your experience on which settings to target to minimize inequities and disparities across Oregon?
So here's the thing. I will say that universally, all parents probably need support, reinforcement, etc. I mean, look, I have two teenagers who routinely tell me that I'm doing it all wrong, right? That's their job. So I like to hear from my own children's pediatrician, you know, you're doing a good job. yes, I mean, even though I'm in the line of work where I allegedly know what I'm doing, right? I still like to hear that reinforcement. So I think that's important to recognize that. And for a relatively inexpensive intervention, I wouldn't withhold it from certain, communities or areas necessarily. Where you choose to target funding for support to kind of reduce the activation energy for certain places to do it would be places that you see higher need, higher disparities, so on. Often those are community health centers, but let's also remember that there's many communities in which children that are affected by adversity and poverty are being seen in all sorts of different systems. So I think asking people about their payer mix, about whatever they may know about income levels, recognizing we don't always have that information, or looking also just at outcomes in terms of school districts and so on, would be where you could say, this is where we can target these things. And then also making sure that whatever advice we're giving, whatever guidance we're giving, is culturally not tone deaf and is not patronizing or anything like that, right? We want to make sure we're being as supportive and positive and inclusive as possible, including asking the parents that in our populations, if they can help us out, what messaging will help them the most. I think there's bad ways to do this as well, but there's many good ways.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you again, Dr. Navsaria. So round of virtual and real applause in the chat box and on video as we are. Thank you again so much for being with us.